Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of Taking Back the Narrative podcast. I'm very honored to have back on as a second-time guest, Ido Reif. For those of you who have seen episode 2, The British Occupation, How the British Betrayed the Jews, a welcome face with Ido. And for those who are new to this channel, I'm very honored to have Ido. He's very qualified as he has a Master's of History from Bar Ilan University. So today's topic is the Grand Mufti, progression of Jew hate from Ottoman Arabist to Nazi war criminal. Why are we focusing on this long deceased Mufti when there are numerous Imams, unfortunately, throughout the world right now who are preaching hate against Jews, who are rallying against Israel, calling Jews the sons of apes and pigs? Well, it's because that this Mufti, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who lived a long time ago, unfortunately, his hatred towards Jews has ramifications today. And we hear about Hamas in the news, we hear about al-Qaeda, we hear about Fatah. All of them have their roots to the Grand Mufti and his movement. And so a couple of years ago, I remember that Prime Minister Netanyahu, he shocked the world when he said the Mufti was responsible for the final solution during the Holocaust or the Shoah. And I remember that Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, she pushed back in horror and said, no, Germany alone was responsible. And so there was this pushback, right? So I know that some Jews were, in a way, very supportive of Netanyahu for finally mentioning the Grand Mufti. I know that in my own history classes, I believe the Mufti was mentioned in one little line, just that he met with Hitler. That's all that was mentioned in my public school American books. That the Grand Mufti of Palestine met with Hitler. There was a picture of him shaking hands with Hitler, and that was it. Nothing else was known about it. And so we'll definitely discuss later in the episode just how much danger, and murders of Jews that this Grand Mufti was responsible for. So, yes, like historians have gone back and corrected Netanyahu and said, that's not true. He did not facilitate the final solution. The final solution was already in place, but there was enough criminality, hence why it says the Nazi war criminal in the title, that Ido will expertly get into a little bit later in the episode, just so we can see just how much involvement there really was between him and his Arab movement and the Nazi party. And so it's interesting because the Mufti did not come from this fanatical religious family. So he grew up, he was not that religious. He only wore a turban once he became a Grand Mufti. He attended Catholic school. He also attended a Jewish school run by a non-Zionist Jewish director. That's something important to note. In Palestine, not all Jews were Zionists. Many, of course, were. And his family background included 13 mayors of Jerusalem. And so I turned to Ido to provide a little bit more details on his family, who his family was, and just where he was placed within the Ottoman society at that time.
Well, okay. First of all, it's nice to come back. As for the Mufti and his clan, family, he was born to one of two major clans in what became British Mandatory Palestine. One was the al-Husseinis, who included a lot, as you said, a lot of important people, including mayors of Jerusalem, of other cities. The other one was the al-Nashashibi, who were, well, you should probably understand that Husseini, first of all, the word Hajj does not mean, that's a title, that's not a name. Hajj meant that he, as a boy, his father took him to Mecca to visit the Kaaba, and everyone who performs this commandment in Islam can call himself a Hajj or a Khaja from this point onwards. So he did not grow up religious, but he did become more religious the more time went by. Now, the more, as I said, the Husseinis and the Nashibis were clans that were very influential in mandatory Palestine, and they were sort of competing with each other, and each took kind of a different approach. While at first the Husseinis actually were one of the families that sold Jews land, they very quickly became very radical, very anti-British, anti-Jewish, especially anti-Jewish, and they really wanted the entire country to become part of a greater Syria and basically be ruled by Damascus, or if all other fails, from Cairo. I'm sorry, my throat is not that best today. The Nashashibi went more for let's try to get along with the Jews. Let's try to get along with the British authorities. This really didn't work out for them especially because of people like al-Husseini, Amin al-Husseini, who was a demagogue, and he became radicalized as the more time passes. And at one point, it just flared out into absolute riots during 1920, where he first came up with this lie that we still hear even today. Al-Aqsa is in danger, and this was his idea. This is where it's still coming from. This lie that the Jews want to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock in order to rebuild the third temple on top of it. For him, even Jews praying at the Western Wall was, as he wrote to the British authorities, this was already a violation of Muslim rights in Jerusalem. Just praying at the Kotel, just praying at the Western Wall. That's it.
And I'm very glad that you mentioned the 1920 pogrom and the British, because, as I was doing research for the Taking Back the Narrative website and looking at, British occupation and the Arabs, at first I was under the impression that it was the Arabs driving all the violence and the British just, ignoring it all. But I came across this very interesting quote, to say the least. So it was the former head of the British military intelligence in Cairo, and later the chief political officer for Palestine and Syria. So he wrote in his diary that the British officials, and I quote, inclined towards the exclusion of Zionism in Palestine. So according to this military officer, who was also the financial advisor to the military administration in Palestine from 1919 to 1923. So those dates are very important to remember. So the Colonel Waters Taylor met with the Grand Mufti, who at that time was his name was just, like Ido mentioned, Hajj, because he had made the Hajj, Amin al-Husseini, a few days before Easter in 1920, and told him he had a great opportunity at Easter to show the world that Zionism was unpopular, not only with the Palestine administration, but in Whitehall, meaning with British authorities. And if disturbances of sufficient violence occurred in Jerusalem at Easter, both General Bowles, who was the chief administrator in Palestine in 1919 to 1920, and this is a very interesting name, General Allenby, who was then the commander of the Egyptian force, the High Commissioner of Egypt, would advocate for the abandonment of the Jewish home. Waters Taylor explained that freedom could only be attained through violence. So this quote really does show the very firm partnership between high-ranking British officials and these Arabs, especially al-Husseini. So after the riots, it was very unfair, of course, that Jabotinsky, the famous Jewish resistance fighter and honestly Jewish hero to Jews worldwide, he got sentenced 15 years. Al-Husseini, who was then a teacher at an Islamic school, fled to Transjordan and was charged with inciting Arab crowds, but was sentenced in absentia to 10 years imprisonment by a military court. And all of that led to nothing in reality because unfortunately, it was a British Jew. Ido will go into what happened there with Herbert Samuel, ended up pardoning him. So Ido, if you can describe a little bit more why that happened, who Herbert Samuel was, and what came to be as a result.
Well, so Herbert Samuel was the first commissioner of Mandatory Palestine, and he was a British Jew. Now, his appointment was perceived as a very positive thing by the Jews in Israel at the time. Well, because they didn't really understand where this was getting them. Herbert Samuel was under a lot of pressure. He was not a Zionist, and in fact, as we see in many cases throughout history, when a Jewish person is being given a position of authority, he doesn't want to appear to have dual loyalty. So he wanted to show that he could be as tough on the Jews as anyone else. Now, the British, first of all, yes, I wanted to address everything you just said. The British, especially the ones stationed and running the authorities in Palestine, were violently and vehemently anti-Semitic in general. There was a lot of hatred by them against the Jews, and they were clearly, the sympathies clearly lied with the Arabs, at least at this point in time. We'll probably get to when it kind of changed a little bit, but at this point, they much preferred, as Anthony even famously said, they much preferred the Arabs to the Jews. In any case, Herbert Samuel was doing the usual imperialist British thing, which is divide and conquer, divide between, in this case, the al-Husseinis and the Nashashivis. He gave the Nashashivis the mayorship of Jerusalem, but he gave the one person who was responsible for horrific riots, he gave him the biggest religious authority in the country, which is the Mufti of Jerusalem, the one person who is from now on in charge of all the holy places in the holiest city for free faith in the world. It sounds insane when you think about it like this, because he was just he led violent, horrific pogroms against Jews because he lied bald-faced about it, and as a reward, he gets to be in charge of the whole thing. But Herbert Samuel justified it by saying that this would, but by basically bribing him, this would cause him to become more moderate, less radical. And of course, what we know happened was completely the other way around. The Mufti used his newfound power, authority, and popularity among the Arabs of British Palestine, not only in order to lower the flames, quite the other way around. Um, he uh, repeated the lie again and again, and he planned very meticulously more and more pogroms, which by now had devolved more into ethnic attacks, like the kind we used to see in Yugoslavia. I actually live in Petah Tikva, which was one of the places which was attacked by neighboring Arab villages. I probably should have, maybe I should have shown you the picture where there are still trenches where the Jewish defenders had to station themselves with guns to drive the raiders away. So he did this again in 1921. He did this again in 1924, and every time this was worse and worse. And the worst one of them all was in 1929. In 1929, the Mufti, and again, you might wonder where the British were all this time. They didn't really mind that much because the Jews could take care of themselves as far as they were concerned. They were supposedly there to protect them, but they weren't very sad to see the Jews getting killed. They weren't very fond of them anyway. They were trying to limit the immigration anyway. So as I was saying, in 1929, there was a horrific pogrom, which is still being talked about today in Hebron, which is basically, it was a massacre. It was 60, you mentioned that not all Jews were Zionists, and yes, that is correct, because Jews were basically divided between what we call the old guard, the Hayishuv Hayashan, which was comprised mainly of religious non-Zionist Jews, who were the majority in Jerusalem, for example, and the four holy cities, and you had the Zionist Jews who went out, created new settlements, became pioneers, made things grow, built up, but they weren't located so much in established cities. Those Jewish communities didn't really have much to do with Zionism. They were very, very religious. They were very ultra-Orthodox in our terms today. This didn't matter to the Mufti. This didn't matter to the Nazis afterwards. All he wanted was to kill the Jews, not just in Israel itself, but throughout the Middle East. We'll get to that as well. But we see an amazing example of it in 1929, where simultaneous attacks on the old guard Jews in Jerusalem, Gaza, and especially Hebron, which are frankly horrific. This is nightmare stuff. This is 67 Jewish casualties, Jewish dead. The number of wounded is in the hundreds. They were slaughtered by their, I'm talking about women, children, babies, old men, people who had nothing no way to defend themselves, people who lived side by side with their Arab neighbors for centuries, and suddenly found themselves being ransacked, raided, raped, killed in horrific fashion, to the point where after 6 days, 6 days of it, the British finally decide to get involved. They interfere, they calm things down, they pacify things, And then what do they do? They punish the Jews again. They completely ethnically cleansed both Hebron and Gaza out of the Jewish communities that had lived there for quite literally thousands and thousands of years. So basically, the Mufti wins again. His Arabs, his radicals win again. This did not make him rethink his position, rather the opposite.
Especially in addition to the fact that under the British Mandate, Jews were not allowed to have any guns and ammunition, and the Arabs could without any consequences. And
yes, this is why Jabotinsky was arrested, because he was in possession of guns. That's pretty much it. That was the charge.
Right. And then it's interesting, like you mentioned about the Mandate period, right? So the Mufti is basically running around with utmost power. And so he was the leader of the Supreme Muslim Council. He consolidated power into control of all Muslim religious funds. He had utmost control of the mosques, the courts, the schools, and there was fierce opposition to anyone who even discussed cooperation with the Jews, and they were killed. And that reminds us very much of how Hamas operates and how the Palestinian Authority operates. You know, there are moderates in Gaza, there are moderates living in Area A and Area B of Judea and Samaria, but their voices are never heard because they get killed, right? Or how many times in the news do you hear today that, oh, you know, like someone was killed because they were seen as a collaborator to Israel, just because
Hamas and Islamic Jihad and various movements.
They're all branches of this root, exactly. So
the Muslim Brotherhood, yes, which eventually al-Husseini became one of its founding members. But what I was saying was that up to this day, they still revere him, they still admire him.
Absolutely. And then meanwhile, Jews here in America, myself included, again, we had that one little line in our history books. He met with Hitler, shook his hand, but so did many others, you know, even Hollywood celebrities. So not many people outside of the Middle East know the extent of his involvement in terrorism today, in modern terrorism. And so, but I do want to talk to you about, or for you to explain one more thing. So he was a spokesperson for Palestinian Arabs as opposed to Palestinian Jews, right? Because Palestine, for those who are not aware, it was a region, still is a region, includes today's Israel, today's Jordan. And so he was a spokesperson for the Arabs, but he did not ask Britain to grant Arabs independence, right? So what he wanted, and if you can go a little bit further into this, his focus was on greater Syria, right? So he wanted Palestine to be part of the southern province with Damascus as the capital. Jerusalem was not even in consideration.
The idea that Palestine should be a country, which is not a Jewish country, but an Arab country, is very, very new. It did not exist until the 1960s, and it certainly did not even occur to the Mufti. He never called himself a Palestinian. He completely rejected that term. As I said, he wanted a big Syrian state. He didn't think that Palestine was in anything more than a region that was important because Jews were settling there, and as far as his version of Islam went, they had to be removed, shall we say. They have to be killed off. They have to be drawn, banished. But he was not some kind of seeker of independence for anyone. That wasn't something that was interesting to him. Well, what is Palestine to him? What he cared about was two things: amassing personal power and getting rid of the Jews, which he hated. That's it.
And actually, I think
in a letter to Churchill, in 1921, Churchill was then Minister of Colonies. So he had, not only he did not ask Britain to grant them independence, he actually demanded from Churchill that Palestine be united with Transjordan and with Syria. So this shows you how much of Palestinian nationalist he actually was. The greater Syria that we're talking about would have comprised basically the entire Levant: Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel. And this is I think he hoped to see himself as king or caliph down the line. As I said, he was very much into amassing personal power, but it didn't really turn out that way.
And what about, in a way, the French could be blamed a little bit for him turning up more the Islamist tone, right? Because he had such high hopes for Syria, for being part of Great Syria. All of a sudden, 1920, France defeated the Arab armies in Syria. And then the Arab nationalists started to push back and wanting to block Jewish immigration, right, into Israel. So can you talk a little bit more how that prompted him to be more Arab nationalist and anti-Semitic?
I don't think that the French really had that much to do with it. It certainly changed the situation on the ground. Because once, again, we're going back to psychical again, but according to the infamous treaty, Syria and Lebanon, what is today Lebanon, went to France. There was a revolt by pan-Arabs in Syria, which France pretty much crushed. We barely remember it today. But pan-Arabism was only as a movement only strengthened by this loss, because you had people like Faisal, who wanted to reach an accommodation with the Jews. You had people like the Nasashiri clan. All those people were, because they saw that the great powers weren't taking them into account, really, they turned into a more nationalist bent. They went into a more Islamist bent, something that could unite all of them. So again, saying that any of them wanted a Palestinian state would be a massive anachronism. Mm-hmm. But yes, I would say that the fact that the Arabs had to deal with the lies by the great powers, specifically Britain and France, meant that people like al-Husseini got a lot more followers and became much more popular. The more radical and hateful they became, the more people listened to them, especially when it came to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism he did not invent anti-Semitism in the Arab world. It was always there. It was always exists in Islam as well as in Christianity. Pretending otherwise is just not very. What he did invent was, Al-Aqsa is in danger. Al-Aqsa is in danger. This is his contribution. But other than that, he just played up the animosities that already existed. You need to remember that for Muslims, until the end of Ottoman rule, Muslims were the privileged class. Arabs are not, doesn't matter. They were Muslims, and therefore they were better. They were better than the Christians and the Jews, who were the dhimmis, the people of the book, who were second-class citizens. Doesn't even cover it. I would say something more like third, fourth-class subjects. So yes, when you come to people like that and tell them, well, now you have to be in the same class as a despised Yehudi or a Christian dog, and even worse than that, at some point we actually plan to give this country to the Jews because it belongs to them. That's where they come from. That's their homeland. Then those people will go nuts.
And I'm glad you mentioned Al-Aqsa because that was his pièce de résistance, right? Like during his rule. So he saw that Jewish immigration returned, right? All the aliyahs were increasing to Israel. And at the time, the Dome of the Rock, I believe, was pretty much like in shambles, right? It didn't have the gold leaf that it does now. And so what he did, he collected funds from all over the Arab world and even Muslims from India. I think they contributed, I think, the most amount. And all that money that he collected, he used that to plate the Dome of the Rock in gold. And he did that, like you mentioned, not only to increase the importance of Jerusalem to the Muslim world, right? Because in actuality, the Prophet Muhammad never stepped foot into Jerusalem, right? He saw it in a dream. He was on some kind of white horse, right? So many can understand, like, if we have great dreams about a lot of things. It doesn't mean that we're going to be the ruler of whatever kingdom we're dreaming about. And so he did that to uplift the status of Jerusalem, like I just mentioned, and also to increase his own status as this grand ruler, this grand mufti from around the world, right? So the Muslims were looking at Jerusalem now as their, second Mecca in a way. And he wanted that all to be thanks to his efforts. So that's something to really push back on, right? When people say, oh, the Dome of the Rock, Jerusalem, it's, the third holiest place to Muslims. But then you have, actual Muslim Zionist, one that I love to quote from, Imam Tawhidi. He's the one who always says, actually, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was not really in Jerusalem. If you look at historical maps, it's more in Saudi Arabia somewhere, maybe even Iraq. And he says that actually Jerusalem is not holy, to Muslims. Muslims do not pray towards the direction of Jerusalem. Only Jews do, right? And if
Jerusalem does not appear once
no.
in Quran. It's just not there. It's not. Yeah.
It's right, exactly. So it's again, like, it's part of the propaganda. And so this all was important, right? Because all under the guise of the Mandate years, right? And a lot of it had to do with just how anti-Semitic the British were. Because if they were not, they would not let him amass so much power, turning Jerusalem into this fake holy city, waging pogroms against Jews. So all of that is building up in the background. And suddenly comes World War II. And if you can describe, because you and I had a fascinating discussion off record about this. And so not only I would love for our viewers to learn more, but I myself will be learning a lot more details about his involvement during World War II, the Farhud in Iraq, which again doesn't get a lot of traction here in America, even amongst the Jewish community. And how exactly did he serve Hitler?
Yeah, okay, so we need to go a little bit back. Hitler takes power in 1933. The moment that the Nazi consul arrived, not an ambassador, because the British Palestine is not a country, no matter how many times people on Twitter will try to convince you of that, it was not a country. Anyway, the Nazi consul arrives a few months later, early 1933, the first person to welcome him with open arms and request that Jews in Germany be treated even worse is our friend Amin al-Husseini. He was very much with his finger on the pulse, and he could see a very kindred spirit in Hitler and his vicious, insane anti-Semitism. So we see his connections to the Nazis as early as that, in 1933, the moment they seize power, all the way in Germany, before they even start anything. He already creates the the sort of alliance, and letting him know, hey, you got someone over here who's on the other side if you ever need me. So the British in Palestine. Yeah, I'm still connected, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
There you are.
So, as I was saying, 1936, he begins an organized anti-British, anti-Jewish revolt. This is actually the first time the British finally realized, oh yeah, this is not just the Jewish problem. This guy wants to kick us out of this region. So for the first time, basically in history, they begin to really push back hard against the Arabs. Even to the point where they allow Jews some minor ways to defend themselves, but that's more of a side note, because what they did between the years 1936 and 1939, let's just say that if Israel did even 1/10 of what the British did to the Arabs at that time, we would have been invaded by the entire world and excoriated as worse than Nazis and all of that. The British had no such reservations. They, when they felt like this was not, this wasn't something they were willing to put up with, then they just went in and just did whatever they felt they had to do. Now, this did take 3 years, as I said, and they didn't really want to touch the Mufti because first of all, they put him there, but more because by this point he was so well entrenched as the leader of the Arabs in Palestine. They tried to put it off as much as they can, but in 1949, before the start of World War II, they realized there isn't going to be any way around it. We're going to have to go in and arrest the person. And at this point, al-Husseini is holed up. So remind you of something. He is holed up in Al-Aqsa, in his mosque on the Temple Mount, and he finds out. I should probably mention, by the way, that the Jews were very well aware of all of his schemes. They recognized him for the threat that he was, and the Jewish resistance constantly kept him under surveillance. I am actually a friend of my best friend is the grandson of the woman who worked for the Haganah in the Jerusalem switchboard, telephone switchboard, and the Haganah had tapped the lines of the Mufti, and everything he did, everything he said, went on the record. We know exactly what his plans were. We know what he thought. We know what he wanted. In any case, back to his revolt. As I said, by 1939, he is holed up, hiding in Al-Aqsa, and he realizes that's not going to cut it. The British are coming for him, so he basically goes down he dresses up like a woman, and he slides away from Al-Aqsa, and people smuggle him out of British Palestine, and at first to Lebanon, and then eventually all the way to Iraq. Iraq at this point, 1939, Iraq is independent kingdom, but an extremely pro-Nazi one. It, in a lot of ways, it's an Axis country, like a minor Axis country, like Romania, Bulgaria, all those in Europe. Iraq was the same. And the Mufti takes full advantage of that. He begins translating Mein Kampf and putting it in the newspapers for free. He takes all the classic Nazi anti-Semitism, the protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. That's where, again, where those translations come from. He made, if he didn't translate them himself, he made sure they would be. And he whips the crowd into a frenzy in Iraq because Iraq was on the verge of war with Britain because the British needed the oil back. The pro-Nazi regime didn't want to give them the oil, and the British knew that by this time the war had started, and the British really had no time for this. They needed all hands on deck. So this is where we get to his crowning achievement at this point, the Farhud. The Farhud is a massive pogrom in Baghdad against the Jewish community. The Jews actually.
I'm so sorry, and this was in
1941. This is in 1941. Yes, early 1941. The Jews actually know something is coming because this is something that can't really be. You could feel it in the streets. The Arabs went around painting their houses, so they knew which places to attack. They asked the British for help. They asked the Iraqi government, provisional government, for help. It didn't help. No one wanted to interfere on their behalf, and in an orgy of death that I can only describe as, do you remember those horrific ISIS videos from a few years back? Imagine that, but made by a mob and stretching out over days and days and days. And at the end of it, we still don't know actually how many Jews were murdered. We know at least 180 were killed. Over 2,000 were beaten, raped, wounded. There were horror stories that I personally heard from people who were there. I had
also mutilations. I was reading
mutilations
how
as well. I said ISIS because I said ISIS because I didn't want to get into overly graphic stuff, but I had I knew a person who testified that he was on the train, and when he was identified as Jewish, he was just picked up and thrown out. He woke up in a hospital, and after one day he got up and he walked away because he could see the doctors and nurses injecting the Jewish patients with injections that just put them to sleep. So before they got to him, he just got up, still on broken bones, and walks away. This is the kind of thing that we see in Europe at this time. This is Nazi level pogroms. So as I said, the British take, but in the end, the Farhud is stopped by a paramilitary Iraqi army, mostly made up by Kurds. They go in, they establish peace, and the Mufti has to run away again, especially because the British are done reconquering Iraq, and now they're looking for him again. and he's a war criminal. So now he goes to where his natural home is, which is Nazi Germany. So he arrives in Germany late 1941, and this is where pretty much, Hitler is on top of the world. He's almost at Moscow. He has defeated France. He's on top of the world. He thinks that he's this close to getting everything he wants. And the Mufti, he receives the Mufti like a king. There is no other way to explain it. That little picture doesn't do it justice. There were parades, there were limousines. This was, I can't even explain how.
It was a hero's welcome, is what I think.
It was a hero's welcome. He's being put up in a very nice villa, which was of course stolen from Jews. He is getting a very nice pension, stolen from Jewish money, and he gets a 90-minute sit down with the Führer himself. Just to put it in perspective, Eichmann never got a sit down with Adolf Hitler, but this guy from Palestine, this Arab, who, by the way, gets honorary Aryan declaration, he does. And what do you think they talk about? It's also not interesting to note, by the way, immediately after the Mufti gets there, Hitler and the Nazis almost stop talking about Semites, as in anti-Semites. They start talking about Jews. Why? Because
Arabs are Semites, right?
Yeah, because they see the Arabs now as their comrades in arms, as their allies. So, as I was saying, what did they talk about, those two people? They talk about their favorite subject, which is the complete annihilation of the Jews. The first thing the Mufti asked for is a promise from Hitler to, when he, as Hitler was indeed intending to do, when he captures the Middle East, that no Jews will remain there. And Hitler happily obliges. This was pretty much what he wanted to do anyway. And now he gets someone who will actively, of the Arab population, who would actively work for that for him. So the Mufti gets a rank in the SS. He gets an office with very nice secretaries, a lot of money, and he gets to work, basically. He gets to work. He calls for jihad on Radio Berlin. He had he ran Radio Berlin in Arabic. He becomes a celebrity in Nazi Germany, and he starts visiting concentration camps and death camps. We know he was in Auschwitz at least twice. He was seen by prisoners there who had survived, and he is astonished. He's blown away. This is better than anything he could have dreamed of. And he gets Eichmann, Himmler, and Hitler to promise him that when they take Israel, they will build one for the 500,000 Jews living there at the time. We know that because we found the documents. We know even where he was planning to build it. He was planning to build it near the biblical city of Shechem, which Americans may know as Nablus, in a valley called Dothan Valley. Until this happens, fortunately, the war didn't really happen, but until it happens, everything is already in motion. He creates a new killing squad. Those were called Einsatzgruppen. They were, even before the camps were created, those were in charge of killing Jews wherever, especially in Eastern Europe. He creates another one called Einsatzgruppe Egyptus, meaning Einsatzgruppe Egypt. And it's not actually in Egypt because Egypt was in British hands. So they sit down in Crete, and those people are made up of people whose speciality is building death camps, gas chambers, crematoriums, stuff like this. He's the guy who's in charge of it. He's the director. Until they get to until Rommel beats when he beats the British in Egypt and sweep into the Middle East, they will follow in his trail. That was already a done deal. Fortunately, Rommel didn't win. He lost, as we all know, at El Alamein in Egypt. And this was when the war starts to go bad for the Nazis. But you know, the al-Husseini doesn't give up. He doesn't get he starts moving in different ways. He raises Waffen-SS divisions among Bosnian and Bulgarian Muslims. Those people, by the way, are called the Hansa, and they are very fanatically loyal to him. We have pictures of them with him, surveying his troops. By this time, there were not many Jews left in those areas. The ones that are, the Hansa take care of, let's put it this way. And he becomes more and more involved in the actual Holocaust. He does. I'll give you two stories. One of them, the first one in 1943. There is, well, basically Bulgaria is known as one of the few Axis countries in which no Holocaust happened, which is correct. The Bulgarians themselves did not give up their own Jews. However, in territories granted to them by the Germans outside of Bulgaria, they did. And why did they do that? Because Mr. al-Husseini writes the King of Bulgaria and says, I want those Jews transported somewhere they won't make any trouble, in, say, Poland. And everybody knows, let's not be naive, everybody knows exactly what that means. And the King of Bulgaria gets his marching orders, and of those Jews, we're talking about tens of thousands of them. Many of them are children and young people. They are shipped to Poland, to concentration camps, and are murdered. And he does it again when there was this was supposed to be again. He does it over and over and over. He does it again, for example, in 1944, when there was talk about exchanging German POWs for Jewish children who had survived up till then. He goes right to Eichmann and makes sure that deal doesn't go forward and that those Jewish children go to Auschwitz.
And is it true that it was a very large amount, right? It was 400,000 Hungarian Jews?
No, I'm getting to this.
Okay.
But and so this is like a little. He does it four times that we know of, but his peaceful resistance is also in 44. In 44, you need to understand this. The Nazis are at this point, they don't have, maybe Hitler still thinks he can pull something out of a hat. The Nazis realize they're screwed. They realize they're still fighting and delaying action, and that there will be no victory for them. There is no way. This is also when we start to see a lot of attempts on Hitler's life, but there was also stuff that people in high ranking Nazis begin to start floating all those ideas around. And one of them was because they know what they're doing, and they know what they have done, and they know because the Allies told them that after the war there will be repercussions. They know they will find themselves on the docket, charged with war crimes. This is, by the way, why we see Nazis occasionally starting to help a few Jews here and there, like if you saw the pianist, because they want to have like a token Jew to show, I have this one, I have that one. So, but this was something huge in comparison. This was major Nazis say, but I need to explain. By this point, the Jews of Hungary are still saved. So we're talking about 400,000 Jewish community, 500,000 Jews in Hungary. Mostly the Jews in Axis allied countries did not want to give up their own Jews. It's not because they specifically liked them, it's because they resented the idea that the Germans can just pick up and tell them what to do with their own citizens. So a lot of that only happened once the Germans had to go in and do it by force. And when it was time to do it in Hungary, basically someone starts throwing the idea, hey, how about this time we just leave those people alone? How about maybe this time we'll just, and we can show it as a show of good faith to the Allies, because we all know our day is coming, and we want to show that we can be reasonable. We can not necessarily. Maybe this will make things easier for us. Again, al-Husseini catches wind of it. He goes ballistic. He's infuriated. Goes back to his buddies, Eichmann, Himmler, Hitler, and he tells them, don't let a single Jew get out of Hungary alive. And the 500,000 Jews in Hungary, indeed, by the time that, the every single bullet counts for the German, every person has to be on the front lines fighting, they still find the manpower and the resources to kill 500,000 people. Why? Well, obviously not just because the Mufti told them so, but as Nazis in those war trials have reliably testified, the Mufti was the fire, the living fire beneath the final solution. He kept pushing for more and more and more. Now, again, I am not saying what Bibi apparently said, that it was his idea or whatever. This was not his idea, okay? This was already well into execution by the time he even got to Germany. But once he was in Germany, he becomes completely complicit in the Holocaust and even becomes a driving force in its continuation and completion. Now,
and that's also an important distinction, right? Because, on one hand, everyone blames only Germany for the Holocaust. And trust me,
first of all, the idea, I'm sorry, I just need to say one thing. The idea, what Merkel had said, that it's only us, it's only the Germans. Well, she's giving the Germans a little bit too much credit. Yes, exactly. The Germans.
It was, first of all, it was collaboration, all of Europe.
It was a pan-European campaign, a pan-European industry, a pan-European endeavor. Yes, the Germans had initiated it, and they're the ones who had directed it, like decided how this thing will go, how this project, but it could never have worked without the willing and eager participation of many, many people from many, many different nationalities.
And even the British, like you mentioned, right? Because if the British had not curtailed, and stopped immigration to the Jewish homeland, this
Yes.
would happen in America, right? Like how many years did America, not let Jews in? And we know what happened to those boats, heading to America. Ended up
the voyage of the damned. Yeah.
Exactly.
This was but we're getting off track.
Exactly.
I want to mention one last thing about World War II, which is compared to what I said about everything he did by now. This is a small change, but just to show you how badly this was important to him, I'm going to tell you about something called Operation Atlas. Operation Atlas was his baby, basically. Operation Atlas was something that he conceived of, al-Husseini conceived of, and it was sending 5 parachutists. 3 of them were German Templars. The Templars were German colonists in Israel before World War II. They were actually the European colonialists. And by the time World War II came around, they became very Nazi. They became very, they wanted to work, they raised the swastika, they wanted to work for the mother country and all that. And the British didn't really have time for them, so they just kicked them out of the country. So, but what they did know, those Templars, they knew Israel. They knew Israel very well because they lived there. So this small parachutist force was made out of 3 German Templars and 2 Palestinian Arabs. And their job was to land by parachute. Again, we're talking about 1944. Just getting a plane from Nazi Germany into Israel is insanely difficult, and this Germany is under invasion. There are Allied troops on German soil, and the Mufti not only has the idea to do this, he actually has the pull. He actually has the influence to get it done. So their job is to parachute, land near Tel Aviv, and poison its waters. At the time, there was no Israel. There was no national water carrier that Israel had built later that supplies water to the entire country. So every little place had its own little springs or water sources or what have you. Well, Tel Aviv, Petah Tikva, which again I live in, and a few other towns, villages, and cities, those were all supplied by fountains at Moshaim, and the job of these parachutists was to dump poison soluble in water to kill all the Jews in Petah Tikva and Tel Aviv.
So as if the massive Jew hatred and criminality could not have been just contained to World War II, you had mentioned a little bit off camera when we were talking that post-World War II, he also was involved with massive campaigns against Jews in the War of Independence, and that he wanted even to bring in Nazis to Egypt to deal with the Israel.
I just want to finish
that, and we'll conclude on that note.
Okay. Well, Operation Atlas was a failure. They did parachute, but they missed it. They landed near Jericho. After a few days, they were arrested by the British. Anyway, onwards. Okay, so after World War II, he is arrested as a war criminal. He is held in France, and he's never brought to trial. The French, forget the key and look around, and by the time they look back, oh my God, where did he go? We have no idea. They didn't, yeah. So he runs away to Egypt, where he sets up shop and goes to fight the Jews again. This time with the help of several Nazis that he had managed to sneak off into Egypt and Syria. And those people are SS graduates. They know how to fight. And al-Husseini gets the command when the War of Independence breaks out, and he makes sure those people train the Egyptian army, just like the British trained the Jordanian army, etc. This doesn't help much because they had all the money they wanted, they had all the equipment they wanted. What they lacked was discipline and understanding of basic military tactics. I'm talking about the Arab generals, the Arab soldiers. They lose. They lose badly because they don't understand how to conduct modern war. But yes, we had, in 1948, we were actually fighting Nazi SS. Some of them were his buddies from Bosnia. Some of them were actually German, low-ranking Germans. But so eventually, the Egyptians just get sick of his failures because he's not getting the job done. They thought, those are Jews. They're not supposed to fight back. We're gonna roll over them in a couple of days. No, it takes almost a year and they lose. 6-7 Arab armies lose to 600,000 Jews. This is completely humiliating to the entire Arab world, and it completely wipes out any credence the Mufti still has left. So by this point, it just loses his influence, his power. He retires, makes way for a new generation, like Arafat, who claimed to be his nephew. Whether he was or not is still under debate between historians. He moves to Damascus. He lives to see the Six-Day War, and he lives to see Israel wins again in Yom Kippur, and he dies in 1974 in Damascus, and he wishes to be buried in Al-Aqsa. And this is the story.
And that's the perfect retaliation, right? Because he worked so hard to defeat the Jewish people, and lo and behold, right, like we emerged stronger than ever. First he witnessed the Jewish liberation of Israel, and I know, like we mentioned, there was no Israel, there was no government of Israel, but obviously there was the Jewish homeland of Israel. So he saw the liberation of Israel basically twice, right, against the British, and then when the Jews beat back the 6 Arab armies, which is just incredible. So thank you so much, Ido, for your very deep expertise on this very complicated topic. Just something, again, I just want to emphasize, it's not something that is at all discussed, like here in America, I'm not sure in Europe. And, again, like when we hear about Jew hatred, and murders of Jews, like we hear, like you said, those big names, Hitler and Eichmann and Himmler, and the Mufti is nowhere to be found, right? Just that one picture, him shaking the hand, and that's it. And it really adds the complexity to how spread out and entangled World War II truly was, especially when it deals with the anti-Jewish campaign around the world, essentially, right? Like you mentioned the Farhud, something else that's not really discussed, which I'm hoping more and more people will learn about, and of course, like what happened in Europe, and even I know we didn't talk about it today, but there were labor camps in Tunisia and starting
Hmm.
in other parts of North Africa. So it really was like a worldwide attempt to exterminate the Jewish people. So
Absolutely.
I thank you so much. And I'll maybe even share a couple links. We can work together what links would be the most appropriate, for this episode. And again, like, thank you so much. It truly is an honor to have had you on again. And
Sure.
hopefully we will have more conversations in the future. So thank you to all the viewers. And if you enjoyed parts of this conversation or all of it, please hit the subscribe button. It's in red right underneath the video. It's free to do. It takes 1 second. And on behalf of Taking Back the Narrative, I truly appreciate all of your support. Thank you so much.